Hello and welcome back to another episode in CSC 280, the Introduction to Cybersecurity at the Delphi University. This is the last episode in our discussion about vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. And in particular, we're going to discuss on how we discover vulnerabilities on our network. Now that we know from the previous video how we can manage the process of detecting and remediating vulnerabilities, and from before that, how we can measure them and figuring out what they are. Now we're going to figure out how to find them. So the easiest way, and also one of the most ineffective ways to an extent, is just to buy a vulnerability scanner and run it over your network. And it will find a lot of information for you. It is a scanner that will discover your network. It will scan each machine on the network to discover what network services it's offering, and it might even go so far as to identify what software and what software version is used to provide each of those services. And so when the vulnerability scanner is done, at bare minimum I have an inventory of systems that provide services, and for the services maybe what software they're using. But there are some limitations with that. One, it will only discover those systems it can access on the network. And there could be all kinds of reasons why systems are not reachable for the vulnerability scanner. And secondly, even by using all kinds of network scanning techniques, you're not necessarily certain that the information that you're getting back is complete and accurate. So at best, what vulnerability scanning software, or I should say in this stage, network scanning software can give you is an overview of what your network looks like, footnote, most likely, or somewhat. Now, the vulnerability scanners can take part of some of the other processes we talked about. So a vulnerability scanner, for example, can go out to whoever created the vulnerability scanner and say, okay, now that I've discovered this list of services running on my network, and I know what software is being used for each of these services, I can cross-reference that service list with a list of what I know to be known vulnerabilities for each particular version of that software. So it's slightly different than patch management. The vulnerability scanner is not going to find out for you if a patch is available. What it's going to do is cross-reference the particular version of the software that you are running with a known vulnerability in that software. And of course that depends on the database that is being used by the vendor and that kind of intelligence that database provides. The network scanner will also give you information about the CVSS and the CVEs and all kinds of other useful information that you can use to make an assessment as to how bad or how good a particular situation is. A vulnerability scanner is not the same thing as a risk assessor. A vulnerability scanner might produce some risk rating for a particular vulnerability, but that's about it. Now, there are more advanced versions of vulnerability scanning that aren't necessarily signature based and only look for known signs of badness. They might to exercise some dynamic behavior to see if there are some previously undisclosed vulnerabilities in software. But now we're going to a whole different kind of products where we're looking at static and dynamic code analysis rather than just traditional vulnerability scanning. Code analysis is not a topic that I discuss a lot in this course. We'll talk a little bit in other classes. But for now, let's assume that a vulnerability scanner basically gives me a report that tells me what's on my network, and of the software that I have on my network, what known vulnerabilities are present. So that's a couple of restrictions there. Again, we don't have the full network, only the parts we could find, and only in those parts the known vulnerabilities. A vulnerability scanner typically does not find any unknown vulnerabilities. It's a good starting point, but it's not a good end point. So we need to build on that, even though that's where many organizations stop. There is something to be said for it, and there is the problem that if a vulnerability scanner gives me a list of problems and I do not remediate those, or I don't remediate them in time, I might be exposing myself to some form of a liability risk, because in the end I did know that there was probably something wrong in my network and I did not fix it. So many organizations might choose to scan, but not scan too much. I want to scan and find what I can fix in a reasonable amount of time, but if my scanner is going to reveal more than what I can fix, I might want to dial it back a little bit. Different discussions. There's always the ideal world and the real world, and unfortunately in most cases the overlap between them isn't perfect. So what else then? Well, we need humans. We can't automate everything, and so I can hire a human and ask that human, say, hey, can you break into my network? And if you can you kind of tell me how you did it so I maybe can fix it? That's the process of penetration testing. A penetration tester is someone who is paid to try and break into someone else's network. Typically, the person who pays the penetration tester is the person who owns the network he's trying to break into. A good penetration tester will take that under advisement. Penetration testing is hacking for a living. And so what we do know is that a good penetration tester, especially if they are giving sufficient mandate, sufficient time, and sufficient scope, will probably find their way into a network, one way or the other. And so, again, it's a matter of cost benefit. How much am I willing to spend on this? For example, I could hire a penetration tester to try and fish their way into my organization, but I also kind of know that that is probably going to be successful already. So what added value do you have at that point? Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind with the penetration testers. One is the scope of work. You want to be really clear when you deal with a penetration tester, or if you are a penetration tester, to know what your authorization entails. What systems are you allowed to scan and which ones are you not allowed to scan? How aggressive can you scan? So in other words, can you do testing which could potentially crash a system? And what do you do once you find a vulnerability? Do you just put it in the report and then by the time that you finish it and you submit the report, your customer will find out? Or are you going to call your customer as soon as you discover it so they can start remediating it? Are you going to turn off network protections so that the penetration tester can actually gain access to your network? Or are you going to leave your network protections on in order to test them? All of these questions are things that you need to answer before you're going to hire a penetration tester and determine their scope of work. Now, secondly, when we start dealing with penetration testers, there are these standards out there, and for example the payment card industry, the data security standards requires in most cases that companies hire a penetration tester, analyze the report and remediate that. But it also means that there are tons of penetration testing companies out there whose goal it is to give you a report that checks the box, not necessarily to give you a report that gives you an honest and fair assessment of the actual risk that you're exposed to. It's kind of a cynical approach to this, but when you hire a penetration tester, you want to communicate upfront really clearly why you want this penetration test to be conducted. Are you looking for a compliance-driven penetration test, or are you looking for a penetration test in which you want to actually discover as many critical vulnerabilities as possible? They're not always the same thing, and the result you're getting is going to be depending on the mandate that you give your tester. Also fairly common is to exclude systems from the penetration tester's point of view, and that might mean that you get a report back that says, yeah, cool, everything is happy. And that's true. The scope that the penetration tester analyzed was mostly okay. But the real bad guys are not going to limit themselves to that scope. And so now you may have created a false sense of security. So whatever you're doing with penetration testing, make sure you define the scope and the expectations really clearly. The other thing to keep in mind is that a penetration test is a point-in-time assessment. It is something that is true at the moment that the penetration test is conducted, but which could no longer be true even a day later when we start rolling out patches automatically. So the lasting value of a penetration test is limited. And that's something to keep in mind as well. In answer to that particular aspect of, why can't I come up with a mechanism that this penetration test is not just a limitation to a point in time, the concept of a bug bounty was invented. A bug bounty is an ongoing assessment, and typically it is an assessment in which a vendor invites testers and say, here is my product, go test away. Just tell me when you find something. And often within a fairly well-defined scope, but it basically is giving the green light, the authority for a security tester to test their skills against actual systems out there. In class, we'll look at some of those bug bounty programs and discuss a little bit more about them. For now, it's important to know that in a bug bounty, you can actually earn money, real money, because many of these bug bounty programs will give you a bounty, money, for finding a vulnerability, as long as, one, the vulnerability is reported, of course, to the company running the bug bounty, and two, you're the first one who's reporting it. Other might give you a t-shirt or a stress ball or whatever it may be, but there are definitely some bug bounty programs out there where people make a living doing bug bounties, and there are companies that specialize in managing and running those bug bounties. Again, we'll talk about those more in class. For now, what's important to realize is that bug bounties are pretty hard to run for the organization that adopts them, and that is for a couple of reasons. If you're giving out reasonably sized rewards, you're going to attract a whole lot of people from all over the world. And while a $100 reward might not be a lot here in the United States, $100 can take you a pretty long way in other parts of the world. And because we are now dealing with internet accessible resources, we're no longer restricted to geographic regions. There's also the matter of, how do I get money to someone if they live in a country that we're maybe not as friendly with at the moment. So, you can add that to your own organization as an overhead, or you can hire an external company that does that will triage the reports coming in to confirm that there is actually an issue, to make sure that only the first report is paid and is reported back to the organization in which the vulnerability was discovered. That's a lot of work. And that should not be underestimated, because if you underestimate it, your program is going to fail. The other part to keep in mind is that, at least from a budgeting point of view, you don't know how many vulnerabilities people are going to find. The whole point of the bug bounty is that you are looking for bugs that you don't know about yet. So it's unpredictable. Many companies will cap the amount of money they're willing to spend on a bug bounty program, and then it's often first come, first served. But especially business folks don't like open-ended agreements where they cannot predict what the outcomes will be. But something like a bug bounty program, that is what's going to happen. You don't know ahead of time what you're going to find. And then lastly, finding bugs is difficult. When you're finding a bug, you may put extra load on the system. You may accidentally break something in the process, and people might find it and decide not to follow the bug bounty disclosure rules and go public with their findings. All of those are concerns that when you're running a bug bounty, you have to keep in mind. And that's why these companies stepped up that run them for other organizations. But a bug bounty does give an extra level of assurance. I wouldn't say it's a starting point for many organizations, but it is something that once your product security and your service security is mature enough, it's something that you can consider. The next stage, maybe in internal operations often, is threat hunting. I'm not going to talk about this too much in this class. We talk about it in other classes as well. But the basic concept of threat hunting is basically, instead of waiting for my systems to tell me like, ding, I found something that's wrong, let's go out and actively look for it. And specifically look for things that our automated scanning might not automatically detect for us. Look for signs of compromise on my network. While I might not necessarily know yet what vulnerabilities there are or what techniques attackers are using, once they are in a system, they might use similar tools and techniques. And if I find those tools or the use of those techniques in my network, there is a chance that I have had a breach. Well, I can only have a breach if I have a vulnerability. Now, detecting of a breach should of course immediately trigger an incident response process, but it can also trigger the vulnerability management process. Threat hunting will help with that. But it is an advanced capability. It's not something you should start with until you have a very well developed incident response capability, until you have a mature capability to do vulnerability and patch management, until you know that you have your basic organizational hygiene in terms of cybersecurity in place. Threat hunting is not going to add a whole lot of value, but it is going to add some complexity and overhead. So this is not for the new, this is not for the faint of hearts, but if you are confident that your organization is at a level that incidents can be responded to appropriately, and that any vulnerabilities you found can be addressed effectively, then a threat hunting process may be something to embrace as well. The last thing I want to talk about is some more passive controls in the network. Now, we know about intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. We know about firewalls, but those mostly are looking for signatures. The idea behind honeypots, honeytokens, or darknets, or deception technology, however you want to call it today, is that I'm going to assign sections of my network to not be used, for example. That's called a darknet or dark IP space. And that means that any network traffic going to or from that network range is going to be suspicious by nature because I decided not to use it. So that could be an early warning system right there. Why is this system trying to connect to these IP addresses that I know don't exist? Well, maybe it's an attacker scanning the network. Something to look into. The other thing is to put up systems that are meant to be hacked, basically. They are systems that are meant to attract an attacker's attention so that, one, the attention is deviated away from actual systems that have risky stuff on them. But secondly, that it's a system that can keep the attacker busy so that I can detect what they're doing. And while I can detect that they're doing, I can quickly shore up my other defenses, or I can try to boot out the attacker as it goes. That is called a honeypot. And so those are computer systems that are set up to detect unauthorized access. A honey token is very similar to a honeypot, but it's a file, for example, that you put on a server. And then you look on your network and see, hey, I know what's in that file. Am I seeing the contents of that file moving over my network? Because if I do, someone has their fingers on something that they shouldn't have. And I might have a very particular random string of characters in a file, and that would unlikely be occurring naturally in other files. Now all of a sudden I see that flying over my network. Now it could be that I'm doing a network backup, but it could also be that an attacker is trying to exfiltrate a whole data set with my file in there. And again, the honey token would help with the detection of that. All of those are more advanced technologies. They can be helpful, but in practice I haven't seen a whole lot of direct use from it. I would say this is a capability that is used only by the more mature organizations, not necessarily by an organization that is just starting out. The concept is really interesting, but the practical use of it is not always there. So at this point we talked about a whole different ways to detect vulnerabilities, from the most simple network scanning and vulnerability scanning technology that maps IP addresses, services and software versions to known vulnerabilities in software, to penetration testing, which brings a hands-on human component to that testing, to then evolving the penetration testing into bug bounties, which is an ongoing effort, and then maybe even more so a threat hunting approach which looks at signs of badness on the network that otherwise would be hard to detect. And then lastly, some of the technologies like honeypots, honey tokens and darknets that could be used to help detect at least suspicious traffic on your network. Maybe not vulnerabilities, but at least there is something there. That concludes our videos on vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. On to the next topic.